This podcast contains graphic descriptions, explicit language, and audio clips that may be disturbing to some audiences. Listener discretion is advised. The Apex and the Abyss presents The Chasm, Episode 18, Artemus Ogletree. Florida, 1915. This is where Artemus Ogletree was born. There isn't much known about Artemus during his childhood. What we do know is that his parents are named Leon and Ruby Ogletree, and that he had two older siblings. Artemus also had two distinguishing features that were difficult to hide. On the left side of Artemis's head, right above his ear, was a large wedge-shaped scar. When he was a young boy, hot grease had burned him, and ever since then, the area on his head never grew hair. Artemus would actually do the best to comb over the scar with his remaining hair. However, you could still tell there was something there. Artemus also had something called cauliflower ear. This is where a person's ear thickens due to damage to the cartilage. At some point, the Ogletree family had relocated from Florida to Birmingham, Alabama. And around 1934, when Artemus was in his late teens, he would leave his home. He had his eyes set on the Golden Coast and wanted to hitchhike his way to California. Throughout his travels, he would stay in contact with his family back home in Alabama, and every so often they would wire him money to sustain him. It is unclear how far and wide Artemis's travels were. We do know that his mother received at least 2 to 3 letters allegedly from her son from other states. However, there was something odd about some of the letters that Ruby would receive. For one thing, the letters were typed, and Artemus did not know how to use a typewriter, and also they were sent to his family after Artemus Ogletree had died. But before we dive deeper into the letters sent to the Ogletree family, we need to take a few leaps back. In January of 1935, Artemus Ogletree would meet a brutal end, and still to this day, there are so many questions surrounding the case. It was the early afternoon on January 2nd, 1935, when Artemus entered the Hotel President in Kansas City, Missouri. When he checked into room 1046, Artemus used the alias Roland T. Owen. He entered the hotel with no luggage or belongings. However, it was later noted that he was well-dressed and put together nicely. Nothing seemed out of sorts. Yet, Artemus would only pay for a one-night stay, and despite the fact that he brought in no luggage, the bellboy, Randolph Props, walked Artemus up to room 1046. While they made their way, the pair had a brief conversation. Artemus told the bellhop that he had stayed at another hotel the night before, but the nightly rate was way too expensive for him. When they got to room 1046, Randolph opened the door for Artemus and watched him as he emptied his pockets onto the bathroom countertop. Artemus had with him a hairbrush, a toothbrush, and a comb. The bellhop would then give the room key to Artemus, and they both exited. At this point, Artemus would leave the hotel for some time. No staff recalls seeing him return. However, when one of the maids, Mary Soptic, went into his room, she found Artemus in there. Artemus would allow her to clean the room while he was present. The maid would later state that Artemus was acting very strangely. He seemed on edge, nervous, and possibly afraid of something. While she cleaned the hotel room, she noticed that he had the curtains drawn and a single light on, so the room was rather dark. He would keep the room like this at all times. Artemus would get himself together to leave while she was cleaning, and when he went to leave the room, he told Mary to leave the door unlocked because he was expecting a friend to arrive. Mary would do so and leave to tend to her other responsibilities during her shift. Around 4 p.m., Mary would return to Ogletree's room to bring him fresh towels. When she entered his room, she came across an odd sight. Artemus was laying on the bed, fully dressed. There was a note on the table by his bed that read, "Dawn, I will be back in 15 minutes. Wait." Other than Artemus laying on the bed and the note, nothing else about the room had changed. Mary would leave the room and she would not return until the next morning. At around 10:30 a.m., Mary went to clean room 1046. Now, there was something a little different about this hotel. You were actually able to lock the doors from the outside. So if you didn't have a key, you were stuck in the room until you were let out, or you called the front desk on the off chance you lost your key. When Mary got to room 1046, she noted that the door was locked. Thinking that Artemus or Roland T. Owens, the name that she knew him as, was not in the room, she used her master key to enter 1046 to clean. To her surprise, she found Artemus in the room. He was sitting in the dark. He seemed to be waiting for something, though she didn't know what. The phone would ring while she was in the room, and she heard Artemus say, "No, Don, I do not want to eat. I'm not hungry. I just had breakfast. No, I'm not hungry." While she cleaned, her and Artemus made small talk. He spoke about the hotel he was at before this one and how their rates were high. He also inquired about her job and the hotel itself. Just like the previous day, Mary returned to 1046 around 4 p.m. to bring fresh towels. From outside the door, she could hear the voices of two men in conversation. She later stated that when she knocked on the door, a deeper and rougher voice responded to her. When she told the occupants that she had brought fresh towels, the voice, whom she believed was not Artemis's, told her that they didn't need them. Mary had cleaned the room a few hours before and knew that she had taken the soiled towels and that there was none in there. She took the hint that whoever was inside the room didn't want her intruding, so she left. A few hours later, occupants of room 1048 would later state to authorities that they heard men and women speaking on their floor. However, it is uncertain if these voices came from Artemis's room or from a party that was occurring in a nearby room on the same evening. The following morning around 7 a.m., a switchboard operator named Della Ferguson was prepping to go through the list of wake-up calls for the morning. Della saw that room 1046's phone was off the hook and she was unable to make the requested wake-up call. Della would inform the front desk, and it just so happens that the bellhop that met Artemus the first day of his stay was on duty. Randolph made his way up to room 1046, and when he arrived, he saw that there was a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door, and the handle to the room was locked. Ignoring the sign on the door, the bellhop banged loudly to alert the occupant inside. While he knocked, a voice from inside the room told him to enter, but Randolph was unable due to the fact that the door was locked, and he did not currently have the key on him. Eventually, the bellhop yelled through the door for Artemus to hang up the phone, and then he left. About an hour would go by and the phone to room 1046 was still off the hook. Another bellhop named Harold decided to make an attempt to figure out what was going on in room 1046. Harold, unlike Randolph, had a key and was able to enter the room. Harold would find Artemus laying on his bed naked, and he appeared to be very drunk. Harold would note that on the bed there were dark stains around Artemus, but he never turned on the lights to inspect further on this. He simply went over to the phone, placed it on the hook, and then Harold exited the room. At about 10:30 a.m., the phone in room 1046 would once again be off the hook. Randolph went this time and came prepared with a key. After knocking and attempting to rouse Artemus, he unlocked the door and entered the room. Randolph would find Artemus on his hands and knees a few feet from the door, and his head was covered in blood. Randolph ran to the phone and placed it back on the hook and turned on the lights in the room. He would see that there was blood on the ceiling, walls, bed, and in the bathroom. Panicking, Randolph ran to get help. By the time he returned with a manager, Artemus had fully collapsed on the floor, and they had difficulty getting the door open because he was pressed up against it. Struggling, Artemus was able to get up, and the two hotel workers were able to enter the room finally. Artemus would prop himself up on the edge of the bathtub while the police and a doctor arrived to help him. It appeared as though Artemus had endured a night of torture. He had been tied up with a cord around his wrists, ankles, and neck. He also had bruising around his neck that looked as though someone tried to strangle him. Even more shocking, Artemus had been stabbed multiple times and had a fractured skull from a bludgeoning. As the doctor began to release Artemus from his bind, he asked him who had done this to him, to which Artemus replied, "Nobody." When asked how he had gotten all of these injuries, he would state that he had fallen and hit his head on the bathtub. Finally, the doctor asked Artemus if he was attempting to kill himself, and he told him no. Soon after the questioning, Artemus would pass out, and they would race him to the hospital. Before we continue on this story, let's take a quick break. Artemus Ogletree would never regain consciousness. He would die from his injuries after midnight on January 5th, 1935. The police were able to rule out that the man in 1046 had tried to commit suicide rather quickly. He had clear knife wounds and there was no knives in the room, which means they were taken with whoever caused these injuries. Also, the fact that he had been bound with a cord pointed to the fact that someone else had inflicted the injuries onto Artemus. The police didn't find much in the room apart from the tag of a necktie, an unsmoked cigarette, a hairpin, a safety pin, and a bottle of sulfuric acid. Fingerprints would also be found on the phone in room 1046. Police would note that they appeared to belong to someone with smaller hands than Artemus. The fingerprints were not matched to anyone at the hotel who had been in the room either. Police would eventually reach out to the public for their help with this case. They believed it to be a homicide, and they knew someone else was involved. Everything pointed to him being attacked, but the police clearly needed more information. When Artemus would leave the hotel, it was a mystery as to what he did. There is, however, one encounter that seemed to match his description. However, it should be noted that this run-in has never been 100% confirmed to be Artemus Ogletree. The night in which Artemus was attacked, Robert Lane was driving in his car about a mile from the hotel. He would later state that he saw a man dressed in pants, shoes, and an undershirt run in front of him. It was January in Kansas City. Looking at the average temperature for that time of the year all those years ago, it was cold out. No one would be caught outside at night without the proper outerwear if they could help it. Anyway, this unknown man would flag Mr. Lane down and ask for a ride. He thought Mr. Lane's car was a taxi. Despite not being one, Mr. Lane agreed to take him somewhere where he could find an actual taxi. Lane would also note that this man was disheveled and that he had a large scratch on his arm. He had also been holding his arm as if it was injured. Eventually, Lane would drop this unknown man out at an intersection and watch him walk off towards a taxi. After Artemus had died, Lane would come forward with his information. On Artemus Ogletree's arm was a deep scratch resembling the one on the unknown man Lane had driven with that fateful night. You can decide whether or not you believe that this man was Artemus or it was merely a coincidence that Mr. Lane came across a similar man. Hotel staff would state that they never saw the man in 1046 leave the hotel, but that doesn't mean that he didn't. Someone matching Artemis's description was seen also at a liquor store, but again, this could not be proven to be him with certainty. Eventually, after not being able to ID who this man truly was, Artemis's fingerprints were sent to the FBI to see if there was a match amongst their files. Turning up little to no leads, it seemed as though the world was going to never know who this man in 1046 truly was. But then, a thought struck officials. They remembered a comment the bellhop Randolph made in regards to the unknown man's timeline. He had said multiple times that he had stayed at another hotel, but thought that their rates were outrageous. Police would head over to this hotel and ask about Roland T. Owens, Artemis's alias. However, no one had ever checked in under that name. But when they described him to the hotel workers, they said that that man checked in under the name Eugene K. Scott. He would also give an address in Los Angeles, California. When authorities looked up the name and address given to the hotel, they came up empty. No one named Eugene K. Scott lived in LA. Time would pass and it seemed as though this man, Roland T. Owens, Eugene K. Scott, would never regain his true name. Things never ceased to be odd when it came to this case. The body would be kept in a local funeral home. In early March, the body was supposed to be buried in a potter's field. Now, a potter's field is designated for such things, a burial site for the unknown. However, Artemus would not be buried there. A call would be placed to the funeral home, and the person on the line asked if they would be able to send money to have a proper burial at a Memorial Park Cemetery in Kansas City, Kansas, so that the unknown man could be closer to his relatives. The funeral home director told the person on the line that they would be informing the police of this conversation, and the caller said that that was fine. The funeral director boldly asked the caller why was this man killed. The caller very bluntly stated that the unknown man had been having an affair and that cheaters get what is coming to them, before he abruptly hung up the phone. A few weeks later, the funeral home received the money that the caller had promised, wrapped in a newspaper. More money would be sent anonymously to cover the expenses of things like flowers. The flowers that were anonymously paid for had a card sent with them. It read, "Love forever, Louise." The funeral would be held, but no one apart from the minister and police officials attended. Even when they staked out the grave, no one ever came to visit the man from room 1046. During all of this, photos taken of Artemus while he was deceased would make the rounds thanks to news circulation. Officials would take a photo of his very noticeable scar on his head in the hopes that someone would recognize him. Finally, his face was seen in Birmingham, Alabama. A friend of Artemis's mother, Ruby, would see the image and bring her the paper. Ruby Ogletree had a hard time believing that this was her son, despite the fact that it looked just like him, but it didn't make any sense. They were still receiving letters from him ever since he left in 1934. Artemis's mother would reach out to the police and gave them information about her son, specifically identifying marks, all of which matched the man from room 1046. Artemus Ogletree finally regained his name. However, police were still scratching their heads. Why the secrecy? Why the aliases? And more importantly, who was contacting the Ogletree family on Artemis's behalf after he had died? Law officials began looking at all the letters that the Ogletree family had received. They came from Chicago and New York, to name a few places. In one of his letters, whoever was writing them to Ruby stated that Artemus was going to travel to Europe. But clearly, this was untrue, because Artemus was already dead. Clearly, they were trying to plant the seed that Artemus may never return home if he was in another country. In August of 1935, Ruby would receive a phone call from a man in Memphis, Tennessee. This man would state that Artemus had helped him in a fight, and that Artemus was living in Cairo, Egypt. He would also tell her that he was married to a woman who was well off, and that they were happy and healthy. However, there is no record anywhere that Artemus actually ever made it to Egypt at any point in his life, so this makes no sense. In 1937, there seemed to be a break in the case. A man who went by the name of Joseph Martin was arrested on a murder charge. During their investigation, police would discover that this man had many aliases, one of which was Donald Kelso. When Artemus was in room 1046, the maid Mary had heard him on the phone with a man named Don, and there was that bedside note. This seemed to be a coincidence at best. However, police were able to match Joseph Martin's handwriting to a letter that had been sent to Ruby Ogletree. So was this the same Don that Artemus was speaking to? If it was, we now know that he is capable of murder. Despite the handwriting match, no charges were brought against Joseph Martin when it came to the murder of Artemus Ogletree. The case has remained open and cold ever since. So who killed Artemus? Did it have to do with a lover's quarrel, or was Artemus involved in a deeper and darker life of crime that we will ever know about? We may never know the answer to those questions. What we do know is that Artemus Ogletree lived a life of mystery, and it ended tragically. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Apex and the Abyss. If you would like to reach out to the show, please feel free to write an email to apexandabyss@gmail.com. You can also find the show on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook if you prefer to communicate that way. You can also submit episode suggestions as well as find links to everything mentioned above in the show notes and at apexandabyss.com, as well as a link to another show I co-host called Monster Madness. If you would like to support the show, you can do that in many ways. You can head on over to Apple Podcasts and submit a rating and review. This costs you nothing but a few moments of your time, and it is greatly appreciated. You can also become a Patreon at patreon.com or purchase show merchandise at tpublic.com. All the links will be provided in the show notes. Again, thank you so much for listening to the show and for your support in telling these stories. Until next time.